morning, everyone.
Morning.
Janice and I are very happy that we could join you this morning. Today I'd like to consider a topic that I explored with you here a couple of years ago, and I'm going to bring it back because to me it's an important one. In the Buddhist churches of America, we benefit from a diversity of views concerning the teachings. So often in organized religion, the opposite situation prevails, namely the exclusion of certain ideas in the interest of doctrinal uniformity. It's tempting for us to think, well, only my idea is valid. Anything that disagrees with it is false, or only one religion can be true, and of course mine is the one. We take an absolutist view about ideas to which we are deeply attached. However, this kind of thinking is contrary to the spirit of Buddhism, which says that there are countless paths to liberation. When we hear contradictory views from various speakers, contradictory views concerning the teachings, instead of causing discomfort, it should be an opportunity for our reflection. Are my ideas about Buddhism justified? Am I deepening my understanding if I only encounter teachers who say things that I agree with? This is an excellent reason for paying attention to teachers from Buddhist traditions other than our own. In doing so, we are better able to place Jodo Shinshu in the context of Buddhism as a whole and to appreciate Shinran's uniqueness. Or we may find that Shinran's teaching is not for us. For those who may be new to the temple, Shinran is the person we regard as the founder of Jodo Shinshu, or Shin Buddhism. He lived 800 years ago in Japan, and he is depicted on the scroll directly behind me. Here at Vista, I once attended a lecture by a Buddhist nun of the Tibetan tradition, in which the key ideas are quite different than what is taught in Shin Buddhism. The Tibetan teacher made a statement that really struck me. As the end of our life approaches, only our spiritual practice will be of any benefit. If I might interpret, in the final weeks or days of our life, we are faced with giving up everything that has been of value to us, everything that is but the spiritual practice that we have cultivated. Only this practice will benefit us. I suspect that people with non-Buddhist views would disagree with this way of thinking. They might say that, on the contrary, having strong ties to family and friends will be of benefit at the end of one's life. Or they might point to personal accomplishments that will provide a sense of fulfillment. Each person must ask, what will be of benefit at the end of life, and then strive to cultivate it. This should be a matter of ultimate concern for us, whether or not we pursue a spiritual path. To better understand the statement by the Tibetan teacher, I need to mention the topic of rebirth. It actually does not come up very often in the BCA, so I will review some of the basics. Within Buddhism, there are traditions that teach practices leading to a favorable rebirth into a future existence. For the moment, I am putting aside any metaphorical interpretation of rebirth, and I am speaking about literal transmigration. That is how many Buddhists around the world understand repetitive birth and death in samsara, the world of suffering. It is cyclic existence as a deluded being on an endless treadmill. Keep in mind that repetitive existence, taken broadly, cannot be considered an advantageous outcome, but in a narrow sense, favorable rebirth means to avoid being born in one of the three evil realms of hell, hungry ghosts, and animals. The other three realms, considered to be good, relatively speaking, are the fighting demons, the heavenly beings, and the human beings. Again, I am describing the view that conceives of the realms in literal fashion. The objective of spiritual practices is to be reborn in one of the good realms, especially that of human beings. And within the human realm, the best outcome is to be born as a person who becomes a follower of a Buddha. Eventually, assuming that this favorable trend continues over many lives, one can hope to become a Buddha oneself and to be forever liberated from birth and death in samsara. As the end of our life approaches, only our spiritual practice will be of any benefit. The Tibetan teacher was referring in part to practices leading to a favorable rebirth. What are those spiritual practices that might lead, after many lifetimes, to the most favorable outcome of becoming a Buddha? For a layperson, it is to live a meritorious way of life. The layperson's practice is to cultivate thoughts, words, and deeds that are wholesome, while avoiding thoughts, words, and deeds that cause harm. However, a monk or a nun is considered to have the best opportunity to cultivate such a life by, among other things, begging for food, studying the scriptures, and meditating. These are the Buddhist practices that will be of benefit as death approaches. They define one type of answer to that question that should be of ultimate concern. How might we evaluate the practices recommended here? First, consider whether the idea of transmigration from physical death to rebirth is literally true. This is the bedrock of Indian spirituality, but for most Westerners, it is far from obvious. From my perspective, the question of literal rebirth is speculative and unanswerable. The same can be said regarding the effectiveness of practices for a favorable rebirth. I cannot determine whether the practices do, in fact, lead to that outcome. However, there is a different question that I can answer without resorting to speculation. Am I capable of performing the practices recommended for a layperson, namely, to embrace that which is wholesome and to avoid that which is harmful? Very likely, given my background, the answer is no. I cannot prepare myself for death and for the next existence in the manner prescribed. So I do not need to answer speculative questions concerning literal rebirth. And rebirth, favorable or otherwise, is not the final goal. Instead, the aim of the Buddhist path is liberation from repetitive birth and death in samsara. The literal view that I have described represents the perspective of a cross-section of Buddhists around the world. For them, it establishes a suitable path that provides a direction for their lives. However, their path is not one that I can access, and it is quite unlike the Buddhism that I learned from Shinran. For me, Jodo Shinshu is the most suitable path, and in fact, the only Buddhist path that I can follow. 8 centuries ago, Shinran reached this same conclusion. It is impossible for me, being possessed of blind passions, to free myself from birth and death through any practice whatever. If I could attain Buddhahood by endeavoring in other practices, but said Namo Amida Butsu and so fell into hell, then I would feel regret at having been deceived. But I am incapable of any other practice, so hell is decidedly my abode, whatever I do. Such, in the end, is how this foolish person entrusts himself to the vow. Beyond this, whether you take up and accept the Nembutsu, or whether you abandon it, is for each of you to determine. This statement to me, demonstrates what it means to be an authentic teacher of Buddhism. An authentic teacher does not take an absolutist view saying, only my idea is valid, all others are false. In fact, Shinran does not portray himself as a teacher, but rather as a student, as a person whose views are provisional and subject to error. From Shinran, I receive an understanding of Buddhist practice that is quite different than what I described earlier, yet I think the teacher's statement is still appropriate. As the end of our life approaches, only our spiritual practice will be of any benefit. Shinran, I think, might say much the same thing. What is a spiritual practice? It is that which brings about a transformation of our minds. Generally, it is understood to be an activity that I perform, and quite naturally, it's referred to as my practice. I bow, I offer incense, I meditate, I chant sutras, I donate my time and money. Outside of Shin Buddhism, this is how a spiritual practice is usually construed. Exerting effort in this way becomes the mechanism for realizing the goal, namely the transformation of our minds. This easy logic, of course, applies to everyday tasks that I face. If I make efforts in the right direction, then I can control the outcome so that things turn out in my favor. Or applied in a Buddhist context, if I perform meritorious actions, then I will have a favorable rebirth. My efforts towards self-improvement are thereby rewarded. In Shin Buddhist terminology, this is the mind of jiviki, or self-power. Shinran, having made such efforts over many years, concluded that he would never achieve liberation in that manner. He recognized that there are no practices he might perform that would be the mechanism for transforming his mind. Instead, it's necessary for foolish beings in this last Dharma age, as he called it, to have the order reversed. Self-awareness, the transformation of the mind, comes first, which establishes the framework for actions that are reflective of the transformation. The spiritual practice is here not an activity that I perform, it is an understanding that I receive, so it's not accurate to call it my practice or my understanding. Limitless reality breaking in on us, in our terminology, is called tariki, or other power. On the path identified by Shinran, this breaking in takes place through hearing the name, Namo Amida Butsu. It is to receive a command by way of Buddhist teachers who are saying the name. In simple English, the command Namo Amida Butsu is, "You there, wake up." The Pure Land Sutras and all of Shinran's writings are translations and elaborations of this command. The scriptures are stating in various ways what it means to have self-awareness, what it means to be a foolish person burdened with blind passions. Deep awareness of one's foolishness is liberation in Shin Buddhism. This awareness is assuredly not brought about by actions that I perform. Rather, it is an understanding that breaks in from outside of me when I hear the Dharma and when I respond to what life itself is teaching. In the Shin Buddhist life of awakening, there is no need for rebirth into a future existence. The present life ends in perfect completion or Buddhahood. Tariki, the command coming from limitless reality, is what brings about the transformation of our minds. And I suspect that as the end of life approaches, as we give up everything else that we have valued, only this transformation will be of benefit. Yet, when each one of us dies alone, bringing along nothing else with us, there will still be one single treasure that we will surely have, Namo Amida Butsu.